Okay, so we can start now. Okay, thanks everybody for being here. Welcome to the Bolin Center Seminar Series, this time of research area number 3, which is water resources, hydrology, and permafrost and glaciers. And we usually invite one researcher from Stockholm University to present their research every year, and this time I'm very happy to present Josefin Thorslund. So you've done your master's, your PhD, your bachelor too at Stockholm University here. So you're going to present the title of your presentation is Freshwater Salinisation, Drivers and Impacts in River Basins Around the World. And this actually got published in Nature Communications. You're going to show a little bit of what you published there, right? Yes. So looking forward to seeing what you have. Okay, my name is Fernando Jaramillo. I'm the research area leader, Unit 3 at the Bolin Center. So Josefin will present around 40 minutes. Your lecture will be 40 minutes. Then we will have some time for questions from the public. So also for those of you that are on Zoom, you may also use the question and answer function. And also important to say that this will be recorded. So will be posted in YouTube. So if anybody wants to see this afterwards, you're invited. So, okay, so Josefin, please go ahead, and thanks again.
Okay, thank you for that nice introduction, Fernando. And thanks everyone who's here physically, and I don't know, maybe we have some people on Zoom as well. It's good, not too intimidating crowd, because it's been a while since I did this physically. But it feels nice to be not just in front of my screen anymore. So yeah, we're going to talk about freshwater that's becoming salty today, and give some examples from river basins in different parts of the world. And I work with this project both here at the Department of Physical Geography here at Stockholm University, and also at the same department but in Utrecht University in the Netherlands. So this is a mobility project. So to start off then, why should we care about salinity and freshwaters becoming a bit more salty? Well, salinisation is actually an important water quality parameter for several different sectoral water uses and also for the ecosystem. And there's quite a lot of research popping up now showing that salinity is becoming more of an issue in several water bodies around the world. So here you see just a few examples. Most of the research so far has been from the US, but also a few examples from Europe, from Spain, for instance. So it's becoming more of an issue we see in research around the world. And then the impacts of when freshwater gets a bit saltier can also be quite wide-ranging. So we can, for instance, have impact on agricultural system, of course, if the water that you irrigate with or water comes into the agricultural system, that could cause salt stress for different crops, and that could then lead to lost yields or less growth of different crops, and also, of course, impact farmer local economy and incomes. There's also been quite some research showing the negative impact of too high salinity levels for biodiversity around the world. And so, yeah, it can threaten the health of many different biota and plants and insects, for instance. And this is even if there's quite a few living organisms that are used to a certain salinity level. If that changes then over time, they can still introduce quite some issues. And also, they can have health impacts on us humans. If we drink water that's too salty, it's not so good. So it can impact our skin, different skin rashes or skin diseases, and also lead to hypertension or other respiratory infections. And I think this is a picture from Bangladesh, where this is quite a severe issue from groundwater drinking sources that are quite saline. So I work with this as I mentioned, in a FORMAS project. So it's a 4-year mobility grant that has been going on now for few years. And this is kind of just the overall title of my project. So water quality impacts water scarcity, accounting for changing freshwater salinity and water scarcity in global drylands. So I'll come into that. So I'm focusing both on looking at salinity levels of different freshwater resources and how that changes over time, and also looking at what's causing these changes. So what are the main drivers, both from human potential drivers and also hydroclimate. And then in addition to that, I want to couple salinity to water scarcity estimations. So looking both at the quality and the quantity of water when we talk about water stress for different water use. So that's sort of the overall aim of my project, and I will go through some published results and some preliminary results from this work during this talk. So I thought we would start focusing on the driver aspect of freshwater salinisation. And of course, we know there's a lot of different drivers that can cause salinisation. And you can see some schematic or some illustration of this in this hydrological landscape here. So we have in orange arrow different potential human drivers. So it can be, for instance, the excessive water withdrawals from groundwater system, which is cause salt water to intrude into the freshwater aquifers. Or it can be different runoffs from industry or urban areas that contains different salt compounds. Agricultural systems are also known to have impacts on salinisation through irrigation or different fertilizers that can also run off in the landscape and run into the streams. And then the different geographic drivers, different soil salinisation processes, saltwater intrusion, some more geological contributions from weathering. And then also, okay, it's not that, I'm not done. These hydroclimatic drivers, so changes in the water balance component, less precipitation, less discharge could cause less dilution of salt, so that could increase. Or if we get more evaporation and more evapotranspiration, that usually also leads to evapoconcentration, so we get more salt enrichment. So the first part of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on how we quantify these drivers and also looking at the salinity variability in different river basins across the world. So to do this, I wanted to use a data-driven approach as far as possible, because a lot of the salinity work that has been done, especially on a more cross-regional to global scale, has mainly used model data. So I wanted to actually use observed salinity data as far as possible. So that was kind of a project in itself, first to try to gather all this data from already taken measurements. So in the beginning of my project, I did a lot of work on this, so trying to synthesize electrical conductivity, which is the most common parameter for measuring salinity. You can also measure it as total dissolved solids. So those are probably the most common ones that you can find in the data. So I looked at that data in both different surface water components, so river, lakes, reservoirs, wetlands, and also in groundwaters. And then I tried to combine those different data sets and harmonize this to make a consistent data set throughout the world. So use everything from like local river basin data portals to more global data set like this GEMSTAT, which is a global water quality data set that measures a lot of parameters, but salinity is one of them. I won't go through the details so much about this work, but it was a lot of harmonization of data. So gathering data with a specific like selection criteria. I wanted it within a certain time period from 1980s up until recent days. And I wanted to have like, coordinate information, dates. For groundwater, I wanted it to be some depth information as well, to be able to redistribute this data and use it in an informative way. So a lot of, working with data sets from like the US and Europe. There's a lot of just conversions with metric system and all of that. So that was something I focused on in the beginning to get this good salinity database to also use for my work. So I wanted to also like bring that up here because it's freely available and it's published now, and with the data set and the description of the data set in this kind of data descriptor publication. So feel free to use that if you're working with these parameters in some way. So there's both groundwater, surface water components, and having quite a few measurements, 16.3 million data points from around 45,000 surface water locations and around 208,000 groundwater locations. So the groundwater locations are more than the surface water ones, but in terms of temporal resolution, the surface waters have more time series data. And this is an example, you can see in this map here, just a little bit how many stations are in each region. So the more lighter green, so North America and Australia have over 10,000 stations with data. And then you can see it varies a bit. And this is just showing some spatial distributions of these different stations. So yeah, if you're interested in working with salinity data, this could be a good resource. And then from this data set, I then started working with my goal of assessing how salty waters are getting in different river basins. So then I selected a subset of this data set, focusing instead of a 30-year period to be able to assess salinity trends, changes over time. And working with water quality data, those of you who do that, I still allowed quite some gaps in the time series. So I said, if they have at least 15 years within this 30-year period, I'm going to include that station. So this map instead here shows all the river stations that fulfill those criteria. So I focused on a few regions then around the world that had relatively good data. And then looking at trends, long-term annual average, and some trend tests. And I also wanted to compare this to some salinity thresholds. And then we used different irrigation water use thresholds because salinity is usually an issue for irrigation water use. That's the main sector that's impacted by salinity. And it's also quite a strict threshold. So if you compare to this one, it will also probably have impacts for other sectors or for the ecosystem. So these are the rivers that we focus on. So the Mississippi in the US, and then Ebro, Rhine, and Danube in Europe, and then the Orange River Basin in South Africa, the Mekong, Southeast Asia, and then the Murray-Darling in Australia. So if we first then look at sort of the long-term annual average of these rivers, so what we did is for each, maybe a little bit hard to see, but each black dot is basically an observation of salinity, a time series salinity data. So for each dot, we then delineated a contributing sub-catchment. So this is approximately 400 sub-catchments in total. And then we looked at the long-term average and we classified them in relation to these different irrigation water use thresholds. So everything that's green on this map is where we don't really see much issue in terms of salinity levels on the long term. Whereas the moderate, the yellow levels is where we start seeing impacts on agricultural productivity. And then the more orange ones is where we have more severe salinity issues. So what you can see maybe from this map quite clearly is there's a lot of green areas. So on the long-term annual averages, we don't have that much issues. 65% of all these 400 sub-catchments were below any impact for irrigation water use. But we can also see there are quite a lot of differences both within and between regions. If you see in Spain there, the Ebro has some red areas, quite a lot of yellow, and quite a lot of green. So it varies, and sometimes within close proximity to each other. But then also not just looking at the long term and kind of average levels, we want to look into these time series a bit more. And this graph instead shows the salinity values on the y-axis, and this red dotted line is where we have this first threshold of 700 microsiemens per centimeters. And then this is all the data points for Mississippi River Basin. And then when this line crosses this red, that's when you can read how many percent of total that exceed this threshold. So here for Mississippi, it was 42% of all the data points exceed this salinity threshold. And for the Orange River Basin, this example was 25%. And looking at all those, I don't want to show all the examples, but looking at the total data set, which was over 400,000 measurements, about 25% exceed this threshold. And what was interesting as well is that we saw quite a lot of exceedance. All this red is above again. And this is from two sub-basins, which we classified as green in the previous maps, where we said there aren't any salinity issues. But if you start looking at the monthly or shorter time scale within a year, you see that there could be temporarily quite a lot of exceedance, which of course can have implications for irrigation water use then. Some different parts of the year, it could be more important to know if salinity is too high or not. And then we also looked at the salinity trends across this 30-year period. And the more orange colored blobs in this map is where we have an increasing trend over this 30-year period, whereas the greener or grayer areas where we have no trend or decreasing trend. So that's when salty water is actually getting fresher over time. And you can see the bar plot there is showing the relative number in each basin. So for the Mississippi, we have quite a lot of sub-catchments that show increasing salinity issues over time. And overall, a little bit more than half showed increasing salinity trends over this 30-year period. So it's not an issue everywhere, but we're definitely moving towards more salty waters in these locations. So after we kind of classified this and looked into that, the main idea was to also look into the drivers of this. So what is causing these salinity changes across space and time? And then we looked at 25 different driver variables. So taking again from this schematic picture here, looking at different parameters that could potentially impact salinity of fresh water. And we selected them based on both what we thought would have an impact. So we've seen from more local, smaller scale studies that irrigation, agricultural parameters could be quite important. So we focused a lot on agricultural related drivers, but also comparing to non-agriculture to see if we can see any systematic differences between these different level drivers. We also wanted to use data sets that were available on the global scale, since we have these river basins spread out across the world. We didn't want to use just local data sets for each of them, because then you also introduce some errors or uncertainty. So therefore, we used a mix of both modeled and observed data sets. And what we did is we looked at the long-term average values for each driver over each of these sub-basins to see if there are any systematic differences across these river basins. And we compared them between these different classes. So salinity impact classes of low, moderate, and high. This is what I will show some results of from now. So hopefully it's not too small, but I will walk you through it. So basically here again, we have the same colors as in the map. So green areas where we don't really have issues with salinity, and then more yellow and orange, we have a lot of salinisation going on. And this is just the normalized level of these different drivers in these different classes of basins. And then on the x-axis, we have a range of these driver variables. So they're grouped over hydroclimatic drivers. So here we have stuff like temperature, precipitation, aridity, discharge, then some of these geographic drivers, and then these human drivers, which include irrigation, water use, and different non-irrigation related parameters. So what you want to do is like look at the difference between the green and orange. And also where we have a little star on top of the box plots, that's where we saw statistically that there was a significant difference between the low and the severely salinized river basins. So we can see a few examples. The first one is this hydroclimatic drivers, where we see a correlation between temperature and also these aridity index, so basically the more arid area or not. What we were a bit surprised with is that we saw kind of the opposite, what we would expect. So what this box plot is showing is that where we have more salinity issues, we have lower temperature and we have less aridity. And what we would expect from more like these evapoconcentration effects and more dry regions, we thought we would get more salinity, higher salinity issues in these regions because we have less dilution of salinity and more concentration with more dry. But we saw the opposite. So in less arid regions, we had more salinity problems compared to where it was more arid. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. We saw some correlation between distance from the coast, so more inland river basins had more salinity issues. And then we saw these consistent effects of irrigation water use. So both for this parameter here, which is irrigation water withdrawals, there was where we had more salinity problems, we also had much more irrigation. And the same for irrigation return flow, so the water that runs back into the river system or groundwater system after irrigation has happened. We did see this for other parameters and also like fertilizers, but the ones cases where we saw this statistically was just for irrigation parameters. But then coming back to this unexpected trend with the hydroclimatic drivers, we wanted to look into this a little bit more, like why is salinity lower when it's more arid? It's not what you commonly see. So then we looked again at these irrigation parameters. So this is now showing irrigation area, irrigation water withdrawals, and irrigation consumption. And these box plots instead now show the more orange you have, the more dry it is, so the higher aridity. So now we see that irrigated area and water use are higher when it's less arid. So that is also a little bit unexpected. You would think maybe you would need to irrigate more when it's drier. But this is what the data told us, and there were all significant systematic differences. But what we think that supports then this pattern of finding higher salinity levels where we had more irrigation. And that happened to be in less arid regions. So we think that the irrigation drivers are kind of overruling this aridity driver. And what it could be behind this pattern is it could be in this more arid region. It's not that we don't need to irrigate more or it needs more water. It's maybe that we don't have enough water to see this increase in irrigation. So the water demand can be high, but maybe it can't be met because it's just too dry, too low water available. There's also been some studies showing some irrigation climate interactions on a more of a local scale, where we get increasing soil moisture and decreasing aridity where we have lots of irrigation. So that could also maybe be a factor or a process behind this unexpected patterns that we saw. But then we also wanted to use a different approach to see if we can see similar effects of these drivers of irrigation. So we used a random forest approach, which is like a machine learning algorithm. And what you can do in this approach is you can try to model salinity, and then the random forest approach can tell you which drivers are more important for getting a good prediction. And this is what this graph shows. We tried to model salinity in areas where we had increasing salinity over time. And then this is a relative scale. So it just means the higher the bar is, the more important it was for the model to be able to predict salinity. So what we can see here, quite a lot of parameters are sort of equally important, and then we see a big jump, and that is for the percentage of irrigated area in each region. So it sort of seems, again, using a different method, that irrigation activities are important for predicting salinity as well. So that's why we came to the conclusion that irrigation is probably quite important to drive salinisation also across this larger scale in quite different regions, which has previously not been shown more at a local scale. So if you want to know more, that's all the details are available in our publication. So focusing on these drivers and long-term trends. So then I want to, for the remainder of this talk, I want to stay on the topic of salinity and irrigation water use. So now we have seen irrigation can be a driver of salinisation. But coupling back to this water scarcity and looking at salinity there, I also want to now focus on what could be the impact if the water is too salt to use for irrigation. So, and that's when this water scarcity framework comes in. So we want to see if we look at both the quantity and quality, and in terms of quality, we focus on salinity, how could that impact water stress and water scarcity for irrigation water use? And also the last part will just be talking a little bit about the potential management strategy to limit water scarcity by using both groundwater and surface water to dilute water when it's too salt. And yeah, as I mentioned before, why we focus on agriculture here is that agriculture can both be a driver and a victim of salinisation. On the lower corner there, you see some crops. I think this is a wheat crop that's been irrigated in this red circle with saline water. You can see already after less than a week that these crops are growing less because they're under salt stress. And we know for a fact that water scarcity is severely threatening food security for many parts of the world. So that's why we're interested in also looking at these impacts. So just to have us all on the same page, like traditionally, water scarcity has just been estimated as the water demand compared to what's available. So you get this kind of dimensionless index. So at the top there you have all sectoral water uses, and then you divide it by the water that's available in the environment. So discharge, for instance, and we usually allocate some flows also to the environments. And then if you get a ratio that's higher than 0.4, you usually classify that as severe water scarcity. And usually, traditionally, this has just been quantified by taking volumes of water into account. So it doesn't matter if it's polluted or not, you just look how much water does irrigation need and how much is available. But there's been more and more research now including this quality component. So it's not enough that we have a certain volume of water available. If it's too polluted to use for industry or agriculture, it's not really available anymore. So kind of coupling that water quantity and quality aspect. So there's been some work also in the group I'm in Utrecht with. But the knowledge gaps which I'm trying to fill is there hasn't been that much focus on the irrigation sector and in the extension, the impact on food production. And those few studies that have looked at irrigation, they haven't focused on crop specifics. So different crops will obviously tolerate different salinity levels. So if you quantify that just on an average level, you might under or overestimate the problem. And also looking at both groundwater and surface water with this quality component that just hasn't been done, basically. So I won't go into the approach too much, but just schematically, my work then focuses on these three components. So those are the water quantities and what's available to use for irrigation. Looking at discharge, for instance, as a measure of water availability, and then looking at these crop-specific irrigation water use. So how much is this plant needing? How much is this crop needing throughout time? And then coupling this to this water quality in terms of salinity, looking at crop-specific thresholds. So after a certain level, you get some impacts on the crops. And I'm also looking at the quality of this water that is used in irrigation. And then finally, looking a little bit into this conjunctive use. So if we need to irrigate a crop with surface water and it's too salty at that point in time, maybe if the groundwater is not too salty, can we use that instead to dilute the surface water and therefore meet the demand at that point? So I will just show a few examples of this as a final. So we applied this to some case study regions. I will just show an example from Central Valley in California here, which is a main food bowl region of the US. They produce a lot of food and it's mainly irrigated. And this pie diagram just shows like the major crops. There are almost 200 crops in this region. So I had to do some reclassification, not to work with 200 different crops. So yeah, looking at the different crops and how much is grown over each of these basins. And then we looked at the monthly time scale. So wanted to look at monthly water scarcity levels between 2008 and 2018. So again, I don't want to take too much time describing the approach, but also here, I wanted to look for reported data as much as possible. So I looked at reported data for how much irrigation water is used for different crops, looked at observed discharge and salinity, of course, and then these different crop salinity thresholds. But then we also used some gridded data of which crops are grown where. This is just an example. It's called Cropscape. So they have like very fine resolution on an annual level, which crop is existing in each grid across the US. And then kind of combining this within this framework. Yeah, there was quite a lot of scaling that had to be done here as well, because most of this data is reported on the annual level. Sometimes it's at larger scale than our catchment. So kind of overlapping the data a little bit and also scaling annual data to monthly values using modeling, kind of developing a correction factor. So yeah, some preliminary results then on water scarcity for this region. First per crop. So here you just see a selection of crops that are growing in Central Valley. And basically when you get these darker orange levels or this brown or this darker blue, you have severe water scarcity. And this INF salinity driven, INF quantity driven, that just means at that point in time, there was no water available of sufficient quality if it's salinity driven. So both the surface water and the groundwater was just too salt to use for this crop. Or if it's the quantity driven, then it's just no water available at that time, maybe severe drought. So you can see already that different crops, of course, have different salinity thresholds and they need different amounts of water. So fruit crops are in general more sensitive to salinity, and that's why they sometimes are really impaired by too high salinity levels. And then all these different crops were then kind of incorporated into the sub-basin average values. So these pie diagram again shows like the distribution. Could have put percentages here. So like this, it's like 25% of all the time. It's severe water scarcity because of this here, for instance. So overall, for these sub-basins, we saw about 29% of all times there was severe water scarcity. And you can see this kind of more darker orange here in these more southwest parts. So these are more issues because of salinity, whereas up here is only blue. So that means it's just no water available to meet the demand in this sub-basin here. Yeah, so it varies depending on where in the landscape you are. Little bit on the temporal impacts, of course, because that varies a lot within the year, and depending when you need to irrigate, it could be good to know if there's more or less water stress. So here you see instead the long-term monthly averages. This is for all the regions in California that we looked at in Central Valley. And you can see again, like up to this quite a strong seasonality pattern where we get increasing severe water scarcity in the summer months. And also, we don't just have enough quantity of water and not enough quality. And this period also, of course, included this very long drought in California between 2012 and 2017. So it's quite a lot of it that cannot be met both to quantity and quality. And then you can see quite different patterns depending on which region you're in. So the middle San Joaquin, which is closer to the sea, it's more heavily impacted by salinity issues. So it's more dark red. Whereas this Sacramento, yeah, you see a little bit of salinity impairment here, but otherwise it's quite low water scarcity on average. So to finish off then, a little bit about the impacts of using groundwater to dilute surface water when the surface water is too salty. So this graph here just shows these cases where surface water is too salt, above any thresholds for different crops. So that's why we always have severe water scarcity with these dark gray bars when this happens. And then if we then include groundwater to dilute the surface water, if the groundwater is not too salty, we can decrease severe water scarcity quite a lot. So sometimes from 100% to like 30% instead for certain months and less for certain parts of the year. And this is just showing this for the total data set of this one sub-basin as an example. So again, we can see for some months quite a lot of decreasing or alleviating of severe water stress if we use both these water sources conjunctively. Of course, there's lots of trade-offs when you use more groundwater instead of surface water. Here you can see which crops need more dilution for this example as well. You can see that the nut crops, so that's mainly almonds and pistachios, walnuts, they need a lot of groundwater then to meet these salinity thresholds because they're quite saline sensitive and they also need a lot of water. So it's like, should you limit severe water scarcity and then increase the pressure on the groundwater system? So this is what we're looking into now, if this is a realistic management scenario, because we also know in California there's a lot of pressure on the groundwater system. And yeah, of course, they grow these crops like almonds because they're high value crops. So you get a lot of money for producing almonds, even if they're super sensitive to salt and they need a lot of water. So kind of thinking about those trade-offs is, of course, also very important for managing agricultural ecosystems. So I want to leave you with a few take-home messages then maybe from this talk. First of all, that we see irrigation both being a driver and a victim of freshwater salinisation across quite a large scale and very different regions. So we need to account for this when we manage future salinity levels and also for developing more robust models of predicting salinity. And then including salinity in these crop-specific thresholds could improve water scarcity quantification and give more a realistic picture and also give indication which crops are maybe more focused on changing or thinking about how to manage. So we don't underestimate or overestimate water scarcity in these regions. With that, we can change to my thank you slide. So thanks for listening. These are just some acknowledgement to farmers, of course, and my data, different data sources. And this is my contact information in case anyone wants to ask questions beyond today. But I'm also happy to try to answer any question now if you have any. So thank you.